On the morning of March 14, 1651, a farmer named Thomas Barwick stood knee-deep in black water inside his own field, 3 miles east of Ely, Cambridgeshire. The water had risen overnight, again. It had been rising for weeks, creeping across the peat, swallowing furrows, and drowning livestock. Barwick owned 40 acres of what the estate records called productive Fenland. None of it was above water. The nearest windmill stood 2 miles away, its wooden arms already turning in the easterly wind. But the drainage ditch it pumped into had burst 2 days prior. The water had nowhere to go. And Barwick, like 60,000 other people living across the Fenland basin of eastern England, a region stretching 3,000 square miles across Cambridgeshire, Huntingdonshire, and Lincolnshire, understood something fundamental. Without mechanical intervention, this land would not stay dry. It never had. The fens were not a place. They were a process. A slow, relentless cycle of water accumulating across a vast, flat depression in the earth, fed by the rivers Ouse, Nene, Great Ouse, and Welland, and by rainfall, that had no natural exit point fast enough to prevent flooding. The land sat at or below sea level. In places it dropped 8 feet below the high water mark of the surrounding rivers. Peat, the compressed remains of thousands of years of vegetation, formed the ground itself, and peat is a sponge. It absorbed water, swelled, and held it. When the peat dried, it shrank and oxidized, dropping the land surface further below sea level. It was a trap built by geology, and for centuries, the people who lived inside it had no choice but to fight the water by hand. The earliest drainage efforts in the fens date to the Roman period, around 100 A.D. The Emperor Antoninus Pius authorized the construction of the Car Dyke, a channel 90 miles long, running from the River Nene near Peterborough, south to the River Witham at Lincoln. It was an engineering feat of enormous scale, dug by hand with iron tools through dense peat and clay. But the Romans never solved the fundamental problem. The Car Dyke moved water laterally, but it could not lift water. The fens sat below the level of the rivers that fed them, and gravity alone could not drain the basin. The Romans left. The dike silted up within generations. The water returned. For the next 1,500 years, the Fenland people lived in a precarious arrangement with the water. They built settlements on the few natural ridges and islands that rose above flood level. Places like Ely, which sat on an ancient glacial deposit 20 feet above the surrounding fen. They farmed the edges. They fished the waterways. They harvested reeds for thatching. They developed a way of life that was neither fully agricultural nor fully aquatic, but something in between, shaped entirely by the seasonal rhythm of the water table. Then, in the early 1400s, the first windmill appeared in the fens. No one recorded the name of the man who built it, or the exact date. The earliest confirmed reference to a drainage windmill in the Fenland region comes from a 1416 estate record in Lincolnshire, describing a mill for lifting water out of the lowland, powered by wind caught on wooden sails. It was a simple post mill, a wooden structure mounted on a raised platform, with the entire body of the mill able to rotate on its base to face the wind. Inside, time equals 300 milliseconds greater than / a set of gears connected the wind shaft to a scoop wheel. A large wooden wheel, 12 to 18 feet in diameter, fitted with paddles around its circumference. As the wheel turned, the paddles dipped into the lower waterway, scooped up water, and deposited it into an elevated channel, lifting it anywhere from 4 to 8 feet, depending on the mill's design. 4 to 8 feet did not sound like much, but across a flat, featureless plain where the land itself sat below sea level, those 4 to 8 feet were the difference between dry ground and a lake. The technology spread quickly. By 1500, windmills had appeared along nearly every major drainage channel in the fens. By 1600, the number had grown to over 100. The mills were built in chains. A single drainage ditch might be served by 3 or 4 mills in sequence, each one lifting the water a few feet higher, passing it upstream until it could finally discharge into a river or tidal estuary at a level above the sea. It was a relay system powered entirely by wind. And it worked, as long as the wind blew. The scale of the problem demanded a matching scale of response. In 1634, the Corporation of London funded a project to drain the entire Isle of Bedford, a 400,000-acre tract of Fenland south of the River Great Ouse. The engineer hired was Cornelius Vermuyden, a Dutch drainage specialist who had already completed major land reclamation projects in the Netherlands. Vermuyden's plan was radical in its ambition. Construct an entirely new river, the Bedford Level, running straight across the fen for 21 miles, from Erith in Huntingdonshire to Outwell in Norfolk, carrying the combined waters of several rivers, directly to the sea. He also designed a network of internal drainage channels, each one feeding into a series of pumping stations, where windmills would lift the water from the low-lying farmland up into the Bedford Level and onward to the coast. Construction began in 1634 and continued for nearly 20 years. The work was brutal. Laborers dug through peat that was in places 15 feet deep, working in knee-deep water for months at a time, using hand shovels and wheelbarrows to move millions of cubic yards of earth into the embankments that would form the walls of the Bedford Level. Vermuyden's original design was revised 3 times before completion, each revision responding to flooding failures that had inundated sections of the new drainage before the system was fully connected. The first Bedford Level, completed in 1651, failed almost immediately. Water from the River Nene backed up into the channel during a spring flood and submerged 30,000 acres that had been declared dry only months earlier. A second parallel channel, the New Bedford River, was constructed alongside the first, and together the two channels, separated by a 100-yard wide wash basin, called the Wash, finally stabilized the system by 1661. By the time it was finished, 400,000 acres of peat had been enclosed, drained, and declared farmland for the first time in recorded history. The project employed over 3,000 laborers. It cost the equivalent of £80,000, a figure that, adjusted for the economic weight of 17th-century England, represented one of the largest single infrastructure investments the country had ever made. And at the heart of the system, turning night and day, were the windmills. By 1700, the Fenland drainage network relied on approximately 300 windmills. By the mid-17th century, that number had climbed past 500. At the peak of the windmill era, roughly between 1750 and 1830, historians estimate that as many as 700 windmills operated simultaneously across the Fenland basin, each one lifting water through its scoop wheel, or, in the case of the larger mills, through a mechanism called an Archimedean screw, a helical blade housed inside an angled tube capable of moving water more efficiently over greater heights. 700 windmills, each one turning whenever the wind blew, each one lifting thousands of gallons of water per hour, and all of them working together, in concert, to keep 400,000 acres of land below sea level dry enough to farm. The men who maintained them were called windmillers. A windmiller's job was never finished. The mills required constant attention. The sails had to be reefed or replaced as wind conditions changed. The gears had to be oiled. The scoop wheels had to be inspected for rot and repaired. A windmiller lived inside or adjacent to his mill, often in a cramped cottage built into the base of the structure. He rose before dawn to check the sails. He stayed up past midnight listening to the creak of the mechanism, reading the sound of the gears the way a physician reads a pulse. A blocked scoop wheel could back up an entire drainage chain. A broken wind shaft in a storm could tear the mill apart. The windmiller carried this responsibility alone, or with one apprentice, 7 days a week, 12 months a year, with no relief and no insurance against failure. A typical post mill had a useful lifespan of 30 to 40 years. Years before the constant exposure to moisture, wind, and mechanical stress wore the timber to the point of failure. Replacing it meant dismantling the entire structure and rebuilding it, sometimes on the same site, sometimes not. The cost of a new mill, timber, labor, ironwork for the gears, ran to roughly £200 in the mid-1700s. A sum that represented years of income for the tenant farmers whose land depended on it. The windmillers understood the weather in a way that few professions demanded. A sudden shift in wind direction could stall a mill or overload its gears, tearing the wind shaft clean out of the nacelle. A long period of calm, a week without significant wind, could cause the water table to rise dangerously across the entire basin, flooding fields and threatening the foundations of the drainage network itself. During the dry summers of 1726 and 1762, the Fenland drainage system came close to failure, not because of too much water, but because of too little wind to pump the residual moisture away fast enough. The system was, in the most literal sense, dependent on the atmosphere, and it began to fail in the early 19th century. The first steam-powered drainage engine was installed at Wheel Fen, near Ely, in 1819. It was built by Herschel and Company of Birmingham, and it burned coal to drive a reciprocating pump capable of lifting 50 tons of water per minute, a rate that would have required the equivalent of 10 or 15 windmills working simultaneously. Within 5 years, steam engines had appeared at drainage stations across the fens. By 1850, they had begun to replace windmills entirely. The economics were brutal and simple. A steam engine worked regardless of wind conditions. It operated 24 hours a day, and it could move water at a volume and rate that no number of wooden windmills could match. The decline was rapid. Between 1830 and 1900, the number of operational drainage windmills in the fens dropped from 700 to fewer than 100. By 1920, only a handful remained in use. The last drainage windmill in the fens, Adventurers Mill near Manea, ceased operation in 1945. The mills themselves were not dismantled. Most simply stopped turning and were left to decay where they stood, their wooden frames rotting in the damp air they had spent generations fighting against. Today, the ruins of dozens of Fenland windmills still stand along the drainage ditches they once served, hollow shells of timber and brick, slowly collapsing into the peat, their sails long gone, their gears seized, their purpose erased by steam and then electricity. But the land they saved remained. 400,000 acres of some of the most productive agricultural soil in England. Time equals 450 milliseconds / greater than soil that had been underwater for millennia before 700 windmills, working in relay, lifted the water out of it and kept it there. The Bedford level still carries water to the sea. The drainage network Vermuyden built in the 1600s still functions, maintained now by electric pumps housed in concrete stations, but following the same channels, moving the same water, performing the same task the windmills performed for 2 centuries. The fens never stop trying to flood. They still flood when the pumps fail or the storms overwhelm the system. In 2001, a breach in the drainage network near Ely put 2,000 acres underwater overnight. The pumps were repaired. The water was pushed back out. The land dried. The process continued. It always continues. The water rises. The land fights back. And somewhere along a drainage ditch in Cambridgeshire, where a wooden windmill once turned its sails into the east wind and lifted the black water up and out of the earth, the ground holds firm, 8 feet below sea level, dry, farmed, and alive. Time equals 550 milliseconds greater than, because 700 men once decided it could be kept that way. If this story moved you the way it moved us, Do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about the windmillers of the English fens. The engineers who fought a continent-sized swamp with nothing but wood and wind. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us. Time equals 300 milliseconds greater than where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family worked the land. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure the windmillers of the fens don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.